Something important just came out of that Brad Holmes interview, and if you really pay attention to the details, you start to understand exactly where this Detroit Lions team is heading, and maybe even more importantly, what they are not willing to do right now. Because this wasn't just a casual conversation. There were clear signals about philosophy, priorities, and the future of this roster. The biggest thing that stood out immediately is how heavily Brad Holmes emphasized the financial side of team building. He kept going back to it over and over again. And to be fair, it makes sense. When you already have cornerstone players on your roster, guys like Aiden Hutchinson and that young core, you have to think ahead. Contracts are coming, extensions are coming, and if you overspend now in free agency, you could end up hurting your own team a year down the line. But here's where it gets interesting. While Holmes is clearly focused on building something sustainable, something that lasts for years, you can't ignore the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there's a bit of hesitation when it comes to taking that next big leap, that aggressive move that pushes you from being a really good team to a true Super Bowl contender. That risk, it doesn't feel like something he's fully comfortable taking right now, and that's where the debate really begins. Because on one hand, you absolutely respect the discipline. You respect the idea of not throwing money at players who might not pan out. We've seen how that can backfire. Bad contracts can cripple a roster. But on the other hand, there are moments, windows, where a team needs to push forward and take advantage of what they've built. And it feels like some of those opportunities might have been left on the table. There was even a subtle example brought up about past decisions, like investing in players who didn't produce versus what that money could have been used for instead. And that's where things get a little complicated, because roster building isn't just about being careful, it's about being right. Another layer to all of this is the dynamic between Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. And look, this is completely normal, but it's real. You can tell there are moments where the head coach likely wants more immediate talent, more firepower, especially at key positions like edge rusher. Meanwhile, the general manager has to balance that with long-term planning and financial responsibility. That doesn't mean there's a problem. It just means there are different perspectives in the building. And honestly, that's healthy. Every great organization has those internal debates. The key is finding the balance, and it sounds like that's exactly what they're doing. Now shifting to the draft, because this is where everything starts to come together. If there's one thing that became crystal clear, it's this. The Lions are not done addressing the edge position. In fact, it sounds like they're just getting started. Based on how Holmes talked about it, there's a very strong sense that multiple edge players could be coming in this draft. Not just one, possibly an early pick, and then another later on. And that tells you everything you need to know about how they view that position right now. Then there's the offensive line, and this is another major takeaway. The approach is simple. Get the best tackle available. It doesn't matter if it's right or left. It doesn't matter how it looks on paper right now. The goal is to build the strongest possible unit and let everything else sort itself out later. And when you connect that to what was said about Taylor Decker, it really feels like the writing is on the wall. Holmes didn't completely shut the door, but let's be honest, it sounded like a team that's ready to move on and reset that position through the draft. The secondary also came up, especially with concerns about injuries and long-term stability. The message there was cautious optimism. There's belief in the players currently on the roster, but also an understanding that you can't ignore the future. That's why it wouldn't be surprising at all to see the Lions target cornerback and safety at some point in this draft, even if it's not at the very top. And when you step back and look at the full picture, everything keeps pointing to the same conclusion. This offseason for the Detroit Lions is going to be defined by the draft. Free agency, mostly done. Big moves, probably behind us. What happens next depends entirely on how well they execute with those picks. And that's where the pressure really kicks in, because if Brad Holmes nails this draft, if he hits on those edge rushers, solidifies the offensive line, and adds depth in the secondary, this team has everything it needs to take that next step. But if he misses, then all of this patience, all of this careful planning starts to get questioned. So now it comes down to this moment, this strategy, this belief in building through the draft above everything else. But let me ask you this. Do you think this approach is enough for the Lions to truly compete at the highest level right now? Or are they being a little too cautious when the window might already be open? And that's exactly where this conversation gets even more serious. Because once you accept that everything is riding on the draft, you start to realize how thin the margin for error actually is. This isn't just about adding depth pieces or developing players slowly over time. This is about hitting on impact talent immediately. When Brad Holmes talks about the draft being the foundation, you can see the confidence in that approach. And to be fair, he's earned that trust. The core of this team, players who are already producing at a high level, came from that exact philosophy. He mentioned how some of these guys are even ahead of schedule in their development, which is exactly what you want to hear if you're a Lions fan. That means the system is working, but at the same time, there's a difference between building a strong foundation and finishing the structure. Because right now, this team feels close. Not rebuilding, not figuring things out, close. And when you're in that position, the expectations shift. It's no longer just about developing talent. It's about filling the final gaps with the right players in the right moments. That's why the edge position keeps coming up again and again. It's not just a need, it's a priority. The way Holmes talked about it made it clear that they are actively looking for players who can set the edge first, stop the run, and then attack the quarterback. That identity matters to this coaching staff. They don't just want pass rushers, they want complete players. And that could shape exactly who they target in the draft. Now think about this for a second. If they take an edge early, maybe even in the second round like it's being hinted, and then come back later for another one, that's a serious investment into fixing that unit. That's not a small adjustment, that's a statement. At the same time, the offensive line situation is quietly becoming one of the most important storylines on this team. Letting go of a player like Taylor Decker isn't something you take lightly, but everything that was said points toward a transition already in motion. The mindset is clear. Don't hold on too long, reload, and stay ahead. And if they do take a tackle early, possibly even around that 17th pick, it opens up so many possibilities. You're not just replacing a player, you're reshaping the future of the offensive line. There was even a hint that trading back could be on the table, especially if they feel confident they can still get their guy at tackle while picking up extra value. That's the kind of move that defines a front office. Not just picking well, but maximizing every opportunity. Then you look at the secondary again, and there's this interesting balance between confidence and caution. The updates on players like Brian Branch were encouraging, which is a positive sign. There's belief in the current group, but there's also an understanding that injuries, uncertainty, and long-term planning can't be ignored. That's why adding a corner or safety later in the draft feels almost inevitable. Not necessarily to start right away, but to protect the future of the position. And one thing that also stood out was the confidence in Kelvin Shepard stepping into the defensive coordinator role. That's another internal bet. Another example of trusting development, trusting continuity, and believing that growth can come from within, not just from outside additions. But again, it all ties back to the same theme. This team is choosing patience, discipline, long-term vision, and that's powerful, but it's also risky in its own way because the NFL doesn't wait. Windows don't stay open forever. And while you're building for sustained success, there are other teams making aggressive moves right now, trying to capitalize on their moment. So the real question becomes, can the Lions balance both? Can they stay disciplined and take advantage of the opportunity in front of them? Because if this draft delivers, if those edge players hit, if the offensive line gets solidified, if the depth in the secondary holds up, then everything Brad Holmes is building will make perfect sense. It will look like a master plan unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. But if it doesn't, then the conversation changes completely. And that's why this upcoming draft might be one of the most important moments for this franchise in recent years. Because once you start thinking about that first pick and what it really represents, everything else begins to fall into place. This isn't just about selecting a player at 17 or wherever they end up picking. This is about setting the tone for the entire draft class and, in many ways, the direction of the season. If they go offensive tackle early, like everything is pointing toward, then you're looking at a front office that is fully committed to protecting its foundation and preparing for the future at the same time. It's not the flashy move. It's not the one that wins headlines instantly. But it's the kind of move that keeps your offense stable for years, especially when you already have key pieces in place. And based on what was said, it doesn't even matter if that tackle plays on the right or left side. The goal is simple: get the best one available and figure the rest out later. Now, if they pivot and go edge early instead, that sends a completely different message. That tells you they're prioritizing immediate defensive impact, that they recognize the need to pressure quarterbacks more consistently and are willing to invest premium capital into fixing that right now. And considering how much emphasis was placed on the edge position in that conversation, you can't can't rule that out at all. And here's where it gets even more interesting. What if they don't stay at that pick? There was a subtle but very real hint that trading back is absolutely on the table. And when you connect that with the best tackle available mindset, it makes even more sense. If they believe there are multiple players who can fill that role, why not move back, pick up extra assets, and still get a guy you value highly? That's how you build depth, that's how you create flexibility, and that's how you give yourself more chances to hit on multiple positions, especially edge, secondary, and even depth across the roster. But again, this all circles back to execution, because having a plan is one thing, believing in your philosophy is one thing, actually hitting on those picks, that's everything. Brad Holmes made it clear that they're not completely done with free agency, but let's be honest, the impactful part of it is already behind them. At this stage, anything else is likely depth, low-risk signings, players who won't drastically change the outlook of the team, so there's no safety net here. There's no major move coming to fix things if the draft doesn't go as planned. It's all on this, and that's why the pressure feels different this year. In previous seasons, it was about building, about finding pieces, about establishing identity. Now, it's about finishing. It's about taking everything they've developed and pushing it to the next level, and that's a completely different challenge. Even the way Holmes talked about player development, guys being ahead of schedule, that's encouraging, but it also raises expectations, because if your core is already performing at a high level, then the missing pieces become more obvious. The margin for improvement becomes smaller, but also more critical, and let's not ignore the mindset behind all of this. The Lions clearly value players who can do the dirty work, set the edge, stop the run, play disciplined football. That identity isn't changing. They're not chasing flashy names or one-dimensional talents. They want complete players, and that's going to influence every pick they make. So when you start projecting this draft, don't just think about positions. Think about fit. Think about players who match that mentality, because that's what this front office is targeting. At the end of the day, everything we heard reinforces one thing. The Lions believe in their process. They believe in patience. They believe in building through the draft, and they believe that this approach will eventually get them where they want to go. Now it's time to find out if they're right, and when you really sit with that idea for a moment, it becomes clear that this isn't just another offseason cycle for the Detroit Lions. This is a defining stretch that could validate everything Brad Holmes and this front office have been building since day one, because think about the consistency in the messaging. From the financial discipline, to trusting internal development, to prioritizing the draft above all else. It's all aligned. There's no panic here. There's no reactionary decision making. Everything feels calculated. And for a franchise that for years struggled with identity and direction, that alone is a major shift. But at the same time, the expectations from the outside are no longer the same either. Fans aren't just hoping for improvement anymore. They're looking at this roster and seeing potential, real potential. And when that happens, patience starts to get tested, not because the plan is wrong, but because the opportunity feels real right now. And that's where this entire situation becomes so fascinating, because Brad Holmes is essentially betting that sustained success is more valuable than a short-term push. He's building something that can compete year after year, not just take one shot and fall off. And in theory, that's exactly how you create a winning culture. That's how you avoid the cycle of rise and collapse that so many teams go through.